stigma against single mothers in Korea, the one-child policy in China, and women's inferior status or poverty in any country. Keeping the discussion of adoption at a, quote, divine level and ignoring the actual political and socioeconomic issues surrounding it ensures that the problems which drive adoption will continue. This kind of critique in the blog is actually taking the form of action in the case of some of the Korean adoptees. Some of you may have seen a New York Times Magazine cover story in January, why a generation of adoptees is returning to South Korea. And they're actually mobilizing and joining forces with Korean birth mothers to change the system and change the law. Just in a brief conclusion, one other adoptee, a young woman named Janet Cook, who grew up in Massachusetts, born in China, just graduated from Yale, speaks Mandarin, began to search for her birth parents in Wuhan, where she was born or where she was found. She put up a poster, and she didn't find her birth family, but she found instead 50 families who responded to her sign, hoping they were her birth parents, which is totally amazing because we always thought parents would not come forward because of what they were doing by abandoning their kids was illegal. Disappointed that they were not, but realizing that they had amazing stories to tell, Janet began talking to them. She wrote her senior thesis at Yale about their stories. It's not yet published, but I'm sure it will be. And in a really terrific interview on a site called Gazillion Voices, which is an adoptee online magazine, she talks about wanting to empower birth mothers and fathers by making their voices heard, people who felt that they didn't even have a story to tell. She's now on a Fulbright conducting research in China on parents who adopt kids in China, and I'm sure she'll bring all sorts of interesting perspectives to that. But additionally, she's trying to organize something like the Dandelions in South Korea. Those are the birth mothers who are now politically organized. And I'm sure this will be a long way down the road, but this is apparently her vision. So taking together the Red Thread blogger, Jenna's work, and many other things I don't have time to talk about, I think point to the fact that we're on the cusp of something really new and interesting in this very rapidly changing and interconnected world. Thanks.
So thank you so much, Toby, and everybody who has preceded me on this panel. I wanted to start from a place that I hadn't thought I would want to start from when I was thinking about this panel, but which is prompted by the fact that we have in the audience and participating here in the conference two women who I knew many, many years ago when we were really very young, probably as young as the youngest of you here in the audience, working to launch the reproductive rights campaign in Italy, which is where I'm from. And one of the many slogans that we had in that campaign was a big sign or a slogan that said, in Italian, non più macchine di riproduzione. No longer are we machines for reproduction. But it seems to me, and it has seemed to me, as I've worked on the question of surrogacy and reproductive surrogacy in the past, by now almost 5 years, is that the risk for women of being once again treated as machines for reproduction has perhaps never been stronger. But I think one of the things that we're talking about here today is the conjunction between what we think about and has been analyzed as the motherhood penalty and the motherhood industry, which is in part explicated through the development of the care chains that Sonia talked about, the great expansion in the demand for care work, some of which is familial care work, work in families, but not all of which, and which, as Elizabeth said, repeatedly, Elizabeth used the word, referred to the women who perform this work as being treated as machines or technologies, really, for the production of a certain kind of labor. So for many, many reasons that I also don't have time to go into today, the demand for reproductive surrogacy has really blossomed in the last 10, 20 years. And some of the factors that have converged to develop the market, this is a market, if you like, we've gone from the market in caring for existing people to the market, to a question that concerns a market for babies, and to what I'm talking about, which is the market for the making of babies. These are all different aspects of the cycle. The technology for the making of babies has changed very rapidly in the last 30 years. And one of the, when we started with reproductive surrogacy, what it entailed was essentially that a woman would be hired to, using her own entire body, her own ovum, as well as her own capacity to bear a pregnancy that was produced through fertilization outside of her body, through an IVF. That's what's called traditional surrogacy. And it's what entails one woman's body and another man's, and the man's sperm. Now we have, and we have had for quite a while, a new kind of technology which is related to the development of assisted reproductive technologies, and which we refer to as gestational surrogacy. What happens in gestational surrogacy is that you can separate out the provider of the ovum, the person who's going to gestate and the person who's going to gestate the surrogacy. The result, there are many consequences to this, one of which is that we now have separate markets that are highly developed in different kinds of gametes. So people who are looking for ova or for sperm can access, depending on where they're doing this, descriptions of the ova providers or of the sperm providers, which will say, you know, Ivy League tennis player, or say Jewish, or say 5'3", you know, whatever it is that you may be looking for. But one of the reasons that this is important is that in this extraordinary development of this market that we've had, that has been in part fueled by the realization that the children who are going to be born are not going to look like the women who bore them. This has allowed us to have a racialized and stratified market for reproduction. Now, I have 5 minutes in which to say very briefly, the legal orders, so this means what? That we can have a transnational market for reproductive surrogacy that really crosses many boundaries. So, for example, India, but now increasingly Nepal. 2 weeks ago, Thailand closed down its international commercial surrogacy market. Many different places are involved in many different ways. And these, India, Nepal, Thailand, have been markets not so much for ova, but markets for gestation. Important to note that. The issues that are raised are issues that have to do with the commodification of women, of women's bodies, and also of children. Because there are conflicting legal orders, and there's a great incompatibility between the rules for the recognition of children in some sets of countries and those in other sets of countries, the human dramas that have evolved around reproductive surrogacy have centered in significant part, not exclusively, around the problem of the recognition of the parentage of the children. Because let's say you have German children born of a surrogacy arrangement in India that Germany refuses to recognize as the children of the intended parents, but in India they also don't have parents. And the problem is those children are going to be parentless and stateless. That has led to a succession to various waves of legislation in national countries, and also to jurisprudence, and to attempts that are now being conducted largely under the aegis of the Hague Conference on Private International Law to try to reconcile or to try to come to some agreements, because the dramas are terrible, terrible human dramas for the children and for all of the parents who are involved. But what has actually happened is that the primary court, or some of the major court cases that we have arisen when the children are, in one way or another, brought into prohibitive jurisdictions. And so the courts address the issue on the basis of the best interests of the child, and talking about the best interests of the child, as an English judge famously said, you can't make policy. You know, when you're faced with a child, there's really only one decision that you can make, which is that to recognize the filiation of that child as it is presented to you in that circumstance. You have to grant recognition, because that's what the best interest requires you to do, and it's actually also what humane considerations would require you to do. So the court cases look like an opposition between a hard government, which is trying to insist on a public policy that negates the rights of children born through surrogacy arrangements, and a court that has to decide on the best interests of the child. And frankly, there's not much in the way of either a legal or there is some legal question there, but there's not much in the way of a moral question there. But because this is the way in which the issues arise, what has been completely stripped away from the jurisprudence is from the international jurisprudence, is any discussion of the status of the women who have borne the children. Because that's what drives the concerns, or one of the aspects that drives the concerns of the parliaments who have been making the laws, but which don't come into the discussion, because the discussion now focuses, understandably, on the best interests concretely of the child who is concretely in front of you. The result is that the surrogate mothers, about whom, as a friend of mine who's involved in this industry famously said to me once, when I was talking about surrogate mothers, she put her hand on my arm and she said, "We don't use that term." And I said, "What, surrogate?" She said, "No, mothers." The result is, and why is that? It's because mothers, as a mother, is a legal figure who has many rights. And so the question of the status of these women who bear the children, who are considered to be nothing but, at the best, service providers, but very often nothing but really another form of a reproductive technology. And there are wonderful anthropological studies, actually, of what their treatment looks like in many countries, where you see that they fall completely between the cracks of being regulated as, or having a family status that would give them some rights, or alternatively having a worker status that would give them another set of rights. And they have no rights, actually, because they're not in either one field or the other. The question for, I think, us is that when you're talking about the motherhood industry, you're talking about a blended space. It's true that it's about the commodification or the labor of intimacy, but the labor of intimacy brings together two very different regulatory frameworks, which refer back to very, very different sets of rights, in which the question is, because this is an industry that's here to stay, do we want to adopt a framework that recognizes to surrogate mothers some rights before they give up their children? Or do we have to regulate them the way we would regulate any factory, or not factory worker, any artisan, when he starts producing a table that he's been commissioned to produce. Thank you.
We have a couple of minutes. If anybody would like to put some questions on to the table, we'd be happy to entertain.
Hi, my name is Brian Mull. This question is really more so for Elizabeth. There's an anthropological study about Filipino domestic workers in Hong Kong from Nicole Constable. And during lunch, there was talk on kind of somewhat of the positive effects of when these migrant domestic workers migrate to said countries. And in Constable's anthropological study, she kind of touches on how these women construct entire new gender identities. And that the one day they get off during the week, aside from their home, is that they're expressing gender in a way that they're never allowed to express inside their home, inside their workplace. So I'm wondering if you've ever